Hey friends, I'm Sabrina, the rookie around here. John and Dick are the old school American fans of F1. Thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about F1 lingo. In this next installment of Deep Dives with Dick, he explains racing concepts that often perplex new motorsport fans. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, this is the second part of our series. Now we're going to dive into some lingo that is specific to racing, so in a general sense, because as we know, there's so much you could tell us. So let's start off with, I think, two terms that we hear quite often, which is racing line and apex. What do both of those mean?
Yeah, so Sabrina, apex is really kind of like a subset of the racing line. And the easiest way to think about an apex is just call it the innermost point that a car travels through a corner. In other words, you're moving to the inside of the turn. What is the innermost part of the track or that particular corner? And that is the apex. Now, you will definitely hear terms like early apexes, late apexes. When do you use the early apex versus the late apex? Those sorts of things. And that really then starts to fall into the terminology of the racing line. And to be clear, the racing line isn't always the fastest line around the track. And this is where it starts to get really complex. But this is where the art of racing really starts coming in as opposed to more like the science. If you think about a track, your typical F1 track, you've got some low speed corners, you got some medium speed corners, and you have high speed corners. So many times with a high speed corner, the idea would be is you want to carry as much speed as possible through the corner and maximize your exit speed, which is generally speaking what you want to do with all corners, but you're going to approach it just a little bit differently. In the really fast corners, you're going to take an early apex. In other words, the most innermost part of the corner is relatively early into the corner. And then you release the car and begin allowing the car to move to the outside of the racetrack. You know, anytime you're watching the races, generally speaking, if you have, let's say, a left-handed corner, you'll approach that left-handed corner on the very right-hand side of the track and then turn in. And when you turn in, you'll either, have an early or late apex, depending on the speed of the corner, and you'll move from the very right side of the track to the very leftmost side of the track in order to negotiate that corner. And then at some stage, the car will drift back out to the right-hand side of the track, which is the edge of the track. And this is where we start getting into some of the conversations that we've had before about track limits. With a late apex corner, these are typically your slower corners. And what you're trying to do with the late apex is get the car settled in terms of balance and grip levels much earlier into the corner so that when you get to the late apex of the corner, you start applying the power harder so that you can maximize your exit speed out of the slow corner. And what's interesting about all of this is that you really have to look at the corners in the aspect of how do they fall in the overall sequence around the track. And that helps you also determine what is going to be an early apex versus a late apex turn. And by what I mean by that is the most important kind of corner on the racetrack is the corner that leads onto a long straightaway. The idea behind these corners is that you want to have the maximum speed possible so that you reach your top speed down the following straightaway as quickly as possible. The second kind of corner on a racetrack is the corner at the end of a long straightaway, which is usually a place where you're going to see people trying to outbrake one another. These corners, what's really, really important is to carry speed as deep into the corner as possible so that you can maintain your speed going down the straightaway for as long as possible. The real deal here, of course, is that the longer you maintain your top speed, then the more time that you're able to gain, even if it's only an extra 10 yards before you get on the brakes, you're still producing lap time because you're maintaining that higher rate of speed for longer. And then last but not least, there's the third kind of corner, and that's the corner that will go and connect the second kind of corner, in other words, the corner at the end of the straightaway, with the corner then that leads onto a long straightaway. And this third kind of corner really is just one of those corners that you have to take, and you need to do it in such a way that you don't mess up the first kind of corner, in other words, the corner that leads on to the next longest straightaway. So when a racing driver goes out and looks at a racetrack, the first thing he determines is what's the corner that leads on to the longest straightaway. And that's the corner that he needs to perfect the most first, because that's where the greatest gain in lap time will come from. On the other hand, the least important corner is going to be that in-between corner that is between one turn that finishes a long straightaway versus the turn that opens up into a long straightaway. So the driver then establishes their priority, and that's really how they come up with the optimum line around the racetrack. If you really want to get confused, you also need to realize that in the middle of a race, the fastest way around the track may not be the best way around the track, because you may be defending a faster car and trying to prevent them from passing, in which case you need to go and figure out ways to make your car very wide. You may not do the classical, again, thinking about a left-hand corner, the very classical start on the very right-hand side of the track and then swing the car down to the inside of the track, turning to the left, and then drifting all the way to the outside. You may take a line that's a little bit more of a middle of the road entryway, not the fastest way, but it makes it more difficult to pass because you've put your car in the middle of the track. And so there may not be room for somebody to pass you, let's say, under the brakes. The other side of that is let's say it's a corner that leads on to the longest straightaway. You may actually not go all the way to the outside of the corner. You may only drift out, say, 3/4 of the way outside the corner. And that's going to go and mess up the car behind you, the racing line. It's going to take away their optimum line. So they're going to be slower down the straightaway, and therefore they're going to have a tougher time of passing you down that straightaway. So, that's very high level. It really can get very complicated, but generally speaking, you really focus most of all on those corners that lead onto a long straightaway, followed by the corners at the end of that long straightaway to maximize that top speed that you have going down the straight. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think it does. I want to also follow up with a question. I know that during these deep dives, I'm trying to avoid leading us down too far into the weeds, but I wonder, when you highlighted the decision to not take the traditional or the classical racing line, and you highlighted, the driver behind you or defending, it also seems like things like the weather will come into play as another variable that may make you move off of that, right? And
Absolutely.
Ultimately, these types of decisions are all part of racecraft.
Yes.
And that's what, when we watch as a fan, we should realize some of that comes as a result of the drivers' racecraft developing all those years before we see them on a Formula One grid. And then 2, it's a development of the racecraft as a part of the team's strategy as to how they're going to push and use that car. Right? Like that's part of, those would be team meetings and discussions that, because there's such a group of people who are analyzing each of the tracks and what the car can and cannot do. This is what, when we hear team meeting or what the plan, or if a driver gets confused as to the strategy, these were all things that would have been discussed in those meetings, correct? Of like how you're going to do it.
Absolutely. You bring
Hmm.
up a great point. Like the racing line in the wet, most probably is not going to be anything close to the ideal racing line when it's dry. And the reason is, of course, is that in the wet, you're absolutely just driving all over the track, trying to find where the grip is in each corner. And typically, it is outside of the typical racing line. Um, the what happens over the course of a weekend, of course, is that a lot of rubber gets built up on the inside of the corners, and so when it rains, um, the grip goes away, the rubber gets slippery and all that. So what the drivers do is they drive to the outside of the ideal dry racing line. And it's there that there's, grit and dirt and all that kind of stuff that normally in the dry is not a good thing. But in the wet, man, maybe extra traction. So you'll see them taking lines that are very, very different from what you would see them take if it was dry.
This just makes me even more impressed and inspired by racing drivers because of all the variables that you have to take into account, the memory, the discipline, and knowledge that you have to accumulate. And especially when we put it into rookies and look at what they have to quickly acclimate themselves, it helps me to have a greater level of empathy to the rookies, but also for veterans, a great level of esteem for what they've been able to achieve by
Absolutely.
staying on there. Okay, so we've covered those two topics. Let's move on to two other terms that I think are important. I hear the word setup a lot. I gathered both from what I've watched, what I've learned, and then also from our conversations that these setups change between races. So what does that mean? And then also, I think part of that conversation is handling. And I think you can explain some of the main terms that come into that concept of handling.
So in setups, let's think about two extreme kinds of tracks. You have, let's say, Monaco, which is all relatively slow stuff, short straightaways, that sort of thing. And then you have a track like Monza, which is lots of fast corners, long straightaways. You got a couple of tight chicanes, but generally speaking, that is considered to be a high speed track. And so what you need out of your car is very, very different from one track to the next. And you would never take a Monaco setup, for example, and try to make that work at Monza. So generally speaking, what you would have on your setup for Monaco would be a track, would be a setup where you were producing lots and lots of downforce for starters. You would, because of the tightness of the corners, you would probably have things change like the speed of the steering rack, for example, so that you wouldn't have to turn the steering wheel quite so much to get around the corners because the steering rack is doing all the work turning the wheels versus you having to move your hands so far around to get the car to turn around those really tight corners like you see at Monaco. Um, so as a result, what they're going to be doing is at Monaco, they're going to have wings that are going to be producing more downforce, but also because they're producing more downforce, they're going to have more drag because they don't care about top line speed. What they really want is as much downforce as possible to generate as much speed as possible through the corners. The car is probably going to be a little bit more what we would call oversteery, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes in more detail. But what I mean by that is that the front end has more bite than the rear, basically more grip when you turn the steering wheel, because the car needs to be able to make that turn at a much more rapid rate, even though the corner is slow. But because it's so tight, you've got to be able to handle that. The other thing about Monaco is that it's bumpy. And so you're going to pay particular attention to the spring rates that are on the cars. The cars themselves run what we call a torsion bar, but the torsion bars come in different stiffnesses. And so you'd want a softer torsion bar to allow the suspension to move up and down and absorb those bumps better. And then, of course, to control the torsion bars and the natural frequency of the spring within the torsion bar, the other thing that you would want to do is make sure that the shock absorbers, or as they would call them over in Europe, the dampers, you would want to make sure that they were valved in such a way to be able to accommodate those forces where the wheels are moving quite a bit under the bumps up and down, and control just how fast the wheel compresses and then how fast it comes back to its normal place. It gets very complex. It's like a Rubik's Cube. If you've ever played with one of those, you go and you change one area, and now all of a sudden you've affected two or three other places as well. So that makes it really interesting. But that's Monaco, high downforce, softly sprung, that sort of thing. On the other hand, you take a Monza, and there top speed is king, because you really don't have that many corners over the course of a lap. And those corners are really, really fast corners. So in this case, the wings that you're going to use are going to produce less downforce, but they're also going to produce significantly less drag. And so that will contribute to the greater straight line speed that you have. The other part is because the track is a lot smoother, you're going to be able to run stiffer torsion bars. The natural spring rates of those torsion bars will be higher, which means that you can run the car lower because you don't have bumps to go over, which means that if you lower the car, then the natural ground effect that the car produces, which is downforce with very, very little increase in drag, you can run that car much lower and get away with having the smaller wings. So definitely one of those things. It's all going to be a compromise, whether at Monaco or Monza. But you think about a car such as a Williams. The Williams is a low drag concept, so you would expect it to go quite well at a Monza, but at the same time, it doesn't produce a whole bunch of downforce. And because it doesn't produce a whole bunch of downforce, it's not as good at Monaco. And of course, there's always the issue around, okay, what are the rules dictating to us? There's certainly, for example, last year they went to the ground effect car, which is a completely different setup that you would have compared to the cars that you had in, say, 2021, where the ground effect setup was not allowed. So there's a lot of give and take and compromise in those setups. The other piece is the setup then has an effect on the handling of the car. And we've heard terms like understeer, oversteer, and neutral steering. And understeer, if I'm going to get technical on it, what that means is that the front tires have a greater slip angle than the rear tires, which then means that the front tires are going to slide first towards the outside of the track. Whereas an oversteering car, it means that the rear slip angle is greater. The rear tire slip angle is greater than the front tire slip angle, and the back of the car will slide. And oversteer is what you tend to think of when you watch cars, a car chase in the movies or something like that. What you're seeing with the tail sliding and all that, that's an oversteering car. And then neutral steering is where you have pretty much an identical balance between the front and the rear of the car. You can see this in the high-speed corners, even though there is going to be a little bit of a direction in terms of the car might be just a little bit understeery, a little bit oversteery, but it's much, much closer to being neutral steering. Now, as a comedian, I will tell you that a race driver would call understeer. What that would mean is that that's when the front of the car hits the wall first, and oversteer is when the rear of the car hits the wall first. So there's a whole litany of things that you can talk about. Horsepower is how hard you hit the wall. RPM is how fast you hit the wall. Torque is how far you move the wall. And stagger is what you do after you hit the wall. So there's all these different terms, but that's basically the way to think about understeer and oversteer.
That's great. So let me go back to setups really quick. And then I'm also going to ask a question regarding handling first. Handling part, when we compare a Formula One car against a racing cart, is the racing cart predominantly more of an oversteer or an understeer situation? Or does that also vary depending on the driver and what they like?
Well, there will be some variance, yes, but the cart typically oversteers considerably more than a racing car. And a lot of this has to do with the overall design. If you look at a go-kart, it's actually wider than it is
Mhm.
long. And that width then contributes to a chassis that's quite a bit more unstable. Whereas if you look at a Formula One car, they're actually quite a bit longer than they are wide. Um, but that being said, you take a driver like a Max Verstappen, he was a tremendous kart racer. And so he likes his car to drive more like a kart than a racing car. And so he's going to have a car that's going to have a bit more front bite. It's going to be a car that wants to have the tail slide out from underneath of you sooner. But a guy like Max can stay ahead of the car and drive it to its limit. Oversteer typically is much more unstable than understeer, but if done correctly, it's usually quicker than understeer, although you really don't want a whole bunch of either.
That's really good. That was actually kind of what I was thinking, because when we analyze someone like Max and his amazing ability, it seems like he's doing something very different than others. And I had always wondered if it was this understeer, oversteer element, just watching the races. And then when it comes to setups, it seems like as you go through the year, especially when you talked about how you tweak one thing and then there are other elements that will end up needing tweaking derivative of that, right?
Right.
It seems like as you start to get further down through the calendar in your development efforts, you've kind of figured out if your initial design inside the rules the rules package that you're operating within, it seems like you start to tweak not only knowing the track, but also hopefully understanding your car better.
Right.
And so the setups will, maybe you have similar elements on two tracks, at one earlier in the season, one later in the season, but you learned, oh, this didn't make sense. We better not do that. So you might even
Right.
try to change it up later in the year. So
Yep.
especially since we're recording this in the second half of the 2023 calendar, I think it's interesting to hear how setups could look different than what they may have looked like earlier in the year, now that teams are fairly into that development process of 2023, if not already
Right.
more focused on 24. Last thing, super license. Help our listeners understand, what exactly is it and how does it affect the pool of drivers that we see for Formula One?
Sure. So the super license basically was instituted years ago to make sure that the quality of drivers in Formula One are the very top guys. They don't want to have guys in there who might be of mediocre skill, but they have a rich dad who can just stroke a check and buy them a spot on the grid. They want to make sure that while the guy may have a rich dad, he's also got to be able to drive. And so what they did was is they said, look, we're going to award a certain number of points for success that you have in various championships around the world, but specifically within Formula 3 and Formula 2. And so, if you finish in I believe it's the top four in the Formula 2 championship, that generates enough points, which is 40, to get you your super license so that you can then be eligible to be considered to drive in Formula One. Whereas you could go out and win the Indy 500 and maybe not the IndyCar championship, and that would not be enough to get you qualified to have that super license. And so there's a lot of people who have said that, hey, it's really not fair that other series that are good series around the world. Another one would be the Super Formula Series in Japan. That's some terrific racing. The cars are very similar to Formula 2 cars, but you have to really string together a very impressive set of credentials outside of Formula 2, Formula 3, in order to get that super license to then qualify to race in Formula 1. Like I said, I think if you finish in the top 4 in Formula 2, that gets you your super license. But you pretty much have to be the series champion in some of these other series like IndyCar, Super Formula, to even have a shot at getting the super license. We saw this with last year with Colton Herta. He had 36 super license points. He needed 4 more. And there was no way to get him those extra 4 points by the end of the season. And as a result, he did not have a super license. Nobody was bending. And so guess what? Colton's running IndyCar this year. So like I said, it's a tool basically used to make sure that the very best drivers are in the series, and it also is very much weighted towards those drivers who have come up through the European training system.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that this is very helpful to our new and casual fans to understand the significance of the super license, and especially as they're gaining greater knowledge about the world of formula driving, not just 1, but 2 and 3 and all these other racing series, as you said, the feeder seat, to understand the implications, especially since last year, as you pointed out, with Colton. And this year we haven't really heard a lot yet. It's been kind of quiet, but it is something to keep in the back of our mind as we look to see where contracts will be renewed, who are the potentials. And I think also as Americans who want to see an American on the Formula One grid, it's important to understand what our American drivers are up against if the super license is set up in the way that it is currently.
Yep.
I look forward to another conversation, Dick. Thanks so much for your time, your insight. I know that it was not an easy task to do such a high level of this conversation because there are so many elements we could have gone in deeper. So I thank you for being very efficient with our time.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Okay, friends. The guys and I want to know what you thought of this conversation. Rookies, did we explain something that you'd been curious about? Are you still confused? Want to learn more? As we record more episodes, we'd be happy to add items you would like us to cover. Veterans? What follow-up questions do you think I should have asked? What are you interested in hearing us talk about in the future? Did we miss something? Drop me a line via email. Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. Are you following us on social media? We're in all the usual places. Thanks to those who are sending messages and comments. Feedback from you, our listeners, our 2 Guys, a Girl, and F1 community has been humbling and really encouraging to John, Dick, and me. We know that this is a crowded market, so your words have been and continue to help us build a community and content that we believe in. Thank you. Based on your feedback, we know that if someone hears us, they stick around. So we need your help to get higher in the podcast rankings. We want more people to become aware of us. Please take a moment to rate and review us in your favorite podcast app. Continue sharing our show with your fellow F1 fans. It's listeners like you that are making this podcast a success. It's your endorsement that helps us build the 2 Guys, a Girl, and F1 community. New to the podcast? If so, take some time to catch our earlier episodes. We think if you're a new or casual fan of F1, then you'll benefit from our F1 101 episode. And if you want to learn a little bit more about John, Dick, and me, then you might enjoy our individual episodes where we discuss our F1 origin stories. And with that, let me say, that ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.